In this course, we're going to cover everything that you need to be comfortable and confident as a proficient Excel user. That way, the next time your boss asks you to make a pivot table based on sales by region, you can have it done like that. The course is going to be broken down into sections. If at any point you want to skip ahead, just click on the timestamp down below. I've also left some workbooks down there so you can follow along every step of the way. But let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and dive into it. When we first open up Excel on our computer, we're going to see a screen that looks like this, often referred to as the backstage view. From here, we can open up a blank workbook, or we can pull open one of the recent workbooks we've been working on, a pinned workbook, or a workbook that's been shared with me. If we cannot find the workbook that we're looking for in any of these options, we can search for it right here and pull it open directly from the search bar. Let's start with a blank workbook today. An Excel workbook has at least one worksheet. We can see the worksheet name here at the bottom, and if we want, we can click into that name and rename it whatever we'd like. If we want to add a new worksheet, we simply click on this plus icon to add a new sheet. We can rename that. We can click on the other sheet and drag it to rearrange the order of these sheets. And when we're ready to start editing our sheet, we can click into any cell on this sheet. Currently, we have cell E10 selected, and you can see that cell reference up here in the name box. E10 refers to both the column, column E, and the row, row 10. Before we get any further, let's take a look at the basic layout of a worksheet in Excel. At the very top, we have a green bar here. We can save our worksheet. I always recommend doing that before we get started. And we can also use Control S to save if we want a shortcut. We have an undo button if there's a change that we made that we want to get rid of, and a redo button if we want to reapply that change that we just undid. Below this top green bar is what's referred to as the ribbon. And in this ribbon are multiple tabs. The Home tab having a collection of the most common buttons within groups. Each group is labeled from the font group to alignment, number, styles, cells, and editing. As we can see in some of these groups, such as the number group, there's a small arrow in the bottom right-hand corner. If we click on it, it pulls up a dialog box with even more options. Below the top ribbon, we have what's called the formula bar. When we select a cell and we enter data into that cell, it appears in this formula bar. We can also enter data directly into the formula bar, and it will appear in the cell that we have selected. To enter a formula into the formula bar, we can use this formula button. This takes us to a list of all of the formulas that Excel has to offer, but more on that later. Below the formula bar is the work area. This is by far the largest part of the screen in Excel. Let's open up another workbook and learn a little bit more about data entry in this work area. When entering data in cell A1, we can use the Enter key to save that data and move down one cell to cell A2. If instead we want to save that data and move over a cell, we can use the Tab key. If we want to quickly move the data that we've entered in cell A1 to a new cell, we can find the edge of that cell and you'll see the cursor change right there to a new format. Then we drag that cell to wherever we want to place it, as long as that cell doesn't already have data in it. Now let's say we want to come back into cell E7 to edit the contents of that cell. We can use the F2 shortcut to come right to the editing mode in that cell. We can also double click on that cell to edit it, or we can click on that cell a single time and come back up to the formula bar and edit the contents there. If the new data that we enter in cell E7 is a little bit lengthier text, it's going to appear as if that text is located in both cell E7 and cell F7. To double check this, let's click on cell E7. As we can see, all of that text is entered in E7, and if we come over to F7, the cell is still empty. So when we now enter data into cell F7, we're not going to be able to see all of the text that we have in E7 without clicking into that cell. Let's clean this up so that it's easier for a user to read the data that we have in column E7. If we come up here to the column label E, we can click into that label and then find the edge of that column and drag it over so that it displays the entire data in cell E7. If instead we want Excel to do this for us, we simply double click on the edge of that column label, and Excel is going to auto fit that column. If instead we want to keep the width of this column the same as all the other columns, but we still want to see all of that data displayed, we can go up to wrap text, and essentially what Excel is going to do here is it's going to adjust the height of that row and then put the text on 2 separate lines. Let's take a look at some auto-fit shortcuts that we can use to clean up this table. As you can see, the columns and the rows are both looking pretty sloppy right now. So let's first come over to column E, and if we want to adjust that column so that we can read the header, we can double click on the edge as we did previously, and that's going to make it so that we can read all of the data in that column. But as we can see, this table has multiple columns that are not the right width. So if instead we want to adjust all of the width of those columns at the same time, we can click up here in the left-hand corner of the sheet to select all, and then when we adjust the width of any single column in that table, it's going to simultaneously adjust the width of all columns in that table. But what if we want an even quicker shortcut? Let's use the undo button or Control-Z to remove that formatting that we just applied. Now instead of clicking into these columns, this time we're just going to press Alt and then HOI, which is going to automatically resize those column widths for us. We can do the same thing to row heights with Alt HOA. So a lot of the data that we're going to be entering in Excel is going to be numbers. And by default, Excel is going to display these numbers and other data that we enter in a general format. But there are quite a few different formats that we can choose from when entering numbers into Excel. And oftentimes Excel is going to guess what type of data we're entering. So if we enter a time, if we enter a date, if we enter a percentage, Excel is going to automatically change that format for us. So in this first input field, we're answering how many hours were worked per week, and we've entered 60. Now by default, Excel is keeping that in the general format because it's not a date, it's not a time, and it's not a percentage. But let's say we want to change this over to number format and see what happens. Excel has added 2 decimal places. If we decide that we want to get more specific with these numbers, we can add in more decimal places by going back up to the number group in the top ribbon, clicking on that dialog box and changing the decimal places to add some more here. We can also change the format for negative numbers if we want them to display in red or within brackets or both red and within brackets. Let's go ahead and see how this looks. Okay, so now we have 4 decimal places, but because we have a round number here, I don't think that we need that many decimal places. Let's go ahead and get back into the dialog box and change this back to 2. In this next input field, I've entered my earnings per year at $120,000. Excel is recognizing this as a number and keeping it in general format. But we want to change this to a currency. So let's come over here to the number group, and in the drop-down box, we're going to change our number format to currency format. By default, this is going to be in American dollars. If we want to change to another form of currency, we can open up the dialog box here at the bottom of the number group. And from there, we can change the currency to a different form of currency if we want. But we want to keep this as American dollars for now. In this next field, I'm going to be entering the start date for when I started work at this company. And I'm going to enter that in a standard date format. So once we enter this date and we click back into the cell, we can see that Excel has automatically changed that number format to the date format. Now, if we want, we can come down and go from short date, which is the format that we're currently in, to long date. And because we've changed this display to a longer format, we need to also resize the column width so that we can see that entry. Now, the interesting thing about Excel is that it's actually storing all dates as a single number. And it finds these dates by counting the number of days from January 1st, 1900. So if we take this date and we go back into the number format, you can see that Excel has counted 44,155 days since January 1st, 1900. In this next field, I'm going to enter the time of day that I start this job every day. So let's go ahead and enter 8:30 a.m. because that's when I show up to work, and see how Excel interprets this data. So if we click back in here, we can see that Excel has assigned us a custom number format. And I'm curious what that means. So let's scroll down to the bottom of this dropdown, click More Number Formats. And as you can see under Custom, Excel has given us a custom time format because we entered hours and minutes and we did not include seconds. When entering a time in Excel that includes both hours and minutes, we have to use a colon in order for Excel to recognize that as a time. So in this example, let's enter 8:30 a.m. without the colon. And as you can see, Excel has just kept this in a general format. But what if we just want to enter an hour without the minutes? And in that case, maybe we don't need a colon. Let's go ahead and enter 8 p.m. and see what Excel does with this entry. So Excel has recognized this as a time and once again given us a custom time format. In this final field, we're going to be entering a percentage. So let's say that the percentage of my salary that comes in my bonus is 10%. Now if we enter 10 and follow that with a percentage sign, we can see that Excel has automatically formatted that in the percentage number format. But let's say we want to enter just a normal number and then convert that to a percentage. We have to make sure that we enter that number in decimal format if we want it to convert. So if we want to get 10%, we have to enter 0.1 before converting that number into a percentage. And we can use the shortcut for percentage up here in the number group. As you can see, that converted clean. If we look back over all of the data that we've entered in this worksheet, we notice a trend. All of the data that has been entered in the number format is aligned to the right of the cell, and all of the data that's been entered in general text format is aligned to the left. And this is how Excel organizes your entries to differentiate between text and numbers. Sometimes when we're entering data in Excel, we have a really long number. If that number happens to be at least 11 digits, Excel is going to convert it into scientific notation, which isn't always the easiest to read. One solution is to click on that cell, come up to the formula bar, and see the number in its original form. Or we can go up to the number group and change the formatting into number format to get a much cleaner version of that number without the scientific notation. Let's take a look at how to navigate around in an Excel worksheet, and this is going to be extremely useful when we are editing data. So right here from cell A1, we can use the arrow keys to navigate up, down, left, and right in that spreadsheet. We can also use Enter to move down a cell, Tab to move right a cell, Shift Enter to move back up, and Shift Tab to move one to the left. Now let's say we want to find the edge of this data set. And imagine that the table is quite a bit bigger than it currently is, and we cannot even see the end of the data. We can use the Control End shortcut to take us right to the edge of that data set. And if we want to get back to the very first cell, we simply press Control and Home at the same time to get us back to cell A1. Now let's say we want to get to the complete other side of this row. We can hold down Control and then hit the right arrow to take us all the way to cell F1. Now this also works the opposite direction by hitting Control and the left arrow to take us all the way back to A1. We can also go down to the bottom of this column by holding Control and then hitting the down arrow. And if we'd like to get to the far right corner from here, we just hold Control and use the right arrow. Now let's say, for example, that this table is missing some data. We're in the profit column and the cell F9 is now gone. Now if we come back to cell F15 and we use Control Up, it's going to take us to the edge of the filled data, so to cell F10. If we go Control Up again, it's going to take us to the other edge, and then one more time, Control Up arrow will now take us to cell F1. It's important to remember when using Control and the arrow buttons that this is going to take us to the edge of the data. So if there is a blank cell in our data, it's going to take us to the edge of that data, which is the first filled cell before that blank cell. So from right here in cell F1, we are on the far edge of our data. And if we use Control and the right arrow one more time, it's going to take us to the very far right corner of the spreadsheet, cell XFD1. We can use Control left arrow to get back to cell F1, and Control left arrow one more time will take us to A1. Control down arrow is going to take us to A15, and then one more time, Control down arrow is going to take us to the very bottom of this spreadsheet. Let's use Control Home to get back to cell A1, and then Control Z to undo the deletion of cell F9. Now let's say that we want to start selecting cells in this worksheet instead of just navigating around the worksheet. So let's hold down the Shift button and then use the up arrow to start selecting cells above cell F9. If we also want to select cells in the next row over, row E, we can continue holding the Shift button and use the left arrow. To deselect this current range of selected cells, we can just click anywhere on the worksheet. But what if we'd like to select even more data at the same time? Let's start by pushing the Control button and at the same time press the Shift button and the left arrow to select an entire row. Now if we'd like to encompass this entire table in the selection, let's continue holding down Control and Shift, then press the up arrow to select the entire table. But there's actually a faster way to do this, so let's click out of this selection, and then let's go up to the top left-hand corner of the screen and double-click above this shaded triangle. That's going to automatically select the entire Excel worksheet. But maybe that range is too large for you. Maybe you want to do some formatting only to the cells in this table. Let's click out of that selection, and how about we find a way to select the entire table, but only the data within that table. Let's first click on cell A1, and then let's use Control, Shift, and End to find and select this entire range of data. Now, if you want to select a small range of cells, but you can't remember these shortcuts, there's a pretty easy way to do it. So let's first deselect these cells, and then we can click into the first cell of our selection and drag down to the end of that selection. Now with this range selected, we can see down here at the bottom on this status bar, we're given an average, we're given a count, and we're given the sum of these cells. These are just a few basic functions that Excel is going to always display for us when we have a range selected. But let's say we want to do a little bit more with this range of cells. At the bottom of this column, there's a little icon, and that's our quick analysis. If we click on it, we can see formatting, charts, totals, tables, and sparklines. And if we click on any of these, it's going to insert one of those based upon this range of data. So one of the things that I like to use is formatting and data bars. This is going to quickly display data bars. It's kind of like a bar graph inside of the actual data cells themselves. We've talked a little bit about ranges, but we haven't actually defined what a range is. And a range is really just a selection of cells. So let's say we start here at cell E2 and we drag and select all the way down to cell F15. That range is going to be described as E2 to F15. And the active cell in this range is cell E2. So if I start typing, let's say 65, for example, the only cell that's going to be updated is cell E2. Now let's say that I don't want to actually change the contents of this cell. I have not saved the data in the cell yet by pressing enter, so I can just hit escape, and we'll go back to that original data. Now this is a nice table, but let's say that we want to insert a new column. We can easily do that by selecting the column to the right of where we want to insert our new column and holding down Control, Shift, as well as the plus button. That's going to insert a new column to the left of the column we have selected. But what if we want to insert multiple columns? We simply select multiple columns and then use the same sequence of keys, Control, Shift, and plus all at the same time to insert multiple columns. And per usual in Excel, this is not the only way of doing things. So let's check out another way to insert a column. We can select a column. Let's say we want to use a different shortcut for selecting that column. Instead, we're going to click into any cell in that column and then hit Control Space. That's going to select the entire column, and we can right click on the column header, hit Insert, and that's going to add a new column to the right of that column. And this same trick is going to work for adding rows. If we click into row 7 and we want to add a row above it, we first select that entire row, and then we hit Control Shift plus. If we'd like to use the alternative method of adding a row, we can add another row below row 7 by right-clicking on row 7 header and then hitting Insert. Deleting a row or column in Excel is also very easy to do. We can simply right-click on a column header, then hit the Delete button in the drop-down menu. With a row, we can right-click on that row header and also hit Delete in the drop-down menu. And this allows us to quickly clean up empty columns or columns that we no longer want to use, rows that we no longer want to use in an Excel worksheet. Let's take a look at how to do some basic formatting in Excel. So in front of us, we have a group of lists of data. This is a data set, and each of the 6 columns has a column header. But we want our audience to be able to easily interpret this data. So let's make these headers stand out a little bit. We're going to select the entire first row, and then up here at the top of the page, we have some formatting options under the font group in the home section. And we can bold these headers, we can make them italic, or we can also underline them. And this might be a little bit much, so we can come back and we can actually remove those with shortcuts using Control-I to undo the italics, Control-U for the underline, and let's actually leave the bold for right now. Now, if we want to do even more to differentiate here, we can add some borders. But before I do that, I'm going to make sure I only have the column headers selected, because if I have the entire first row selected, it's going to give me a border around these cells where we don't actually have data over here on the right. So let's select just these headers, come up to borders, and let's say we want to add a bottom border to these cells. Now if we click out, we can see that there's a dark line under these cells, and it makes it very clear that these are our column headers. And we have even more options for applying formatting to these cells. So let's go ahead and check them out. First, I'm going to highlight that top row one more time, and then we can come back up here to the font group in the home tab, and we can see that we can easily change the font if we want that to stand out a little bit more. We can come to the next drop down menu and change the size of that font. But the goal here is to make this data easy to interpret, so we don't want to over format it. And let's look at a few more subtle things that we can do to it. We can change the color of that font if we want to make it red, or we can change that fill. And now we can see that this is really standing out. Now let's say that we really want to see the full potential of formatting options that we have for these cells. Let's go ahead and highlight them one more time and come back up to this font group. We can see there's that little settings icon that we can click to pull up a dialog box. We can also use Control+1 to pull up that same dialog box. And as we can see, we have all of the font options in front of us right here. If we come over to border, we can decide specifically what we want for this border to look like. Let's change it over to outline, and then let's take the thickness and make it just a little bit thicker here, and hit OK to apply those options. And now we can see that that border has extended over here to the right side of the rows. And if we come up here and we add another row on top of this row, we can see that that border is actually covering the top of the cells as well. So let's do a little bit more here to make this data set easier to interpret. Let's say management is going to take a look at it, and we want to make sure that they know what they're looking at. So we're going to come up here and we're going to add a title to this table, to this data set, so that it is very clear what exactly we're looking at. And we're going to call this used car sales data. So this title is looking pretty good right now, but I think we could do a little bit more to make it stand out. Let's merge and center these columns up here so that we can tell this is definitely a title. And then if we come back in here, we can make this bold, and let's make the font just a little bit bigger as well. Now we can clearly see that this is the title of the data set below. Let's take a look at editing data in an Excel worksheet. So we have this data set here, we've formatted it, it looks great, but we want to make some changes. Let's say we click into the column header for column E, that's quantity sold, and we just start typing sales. That's going to overwrite the previous data that we had in that cell. Now this data isn't actually saved until we hit enter or tab, so if we decide we don't want to make those changes, we can just hit the escape button, and that's going to return us to the data we previously had in that cell. So let's say that we want to make some changes to cell D2, that's the column header, and instead of sales price, we just want to say sales. So we can double click into that cell. Now let's say that we want to select letters one by one in the cell. We can hold down Shift and use the left arrow to individually select each of those letters. We can also use Control Shift and the left arrow to select words individually. So hitting that once is going to select all of sales, Control Shift and right arrow. This highlights the entire word price, and then we can simply hit the delete button to remove that word and hit enter to save that data in Excel. So this data set's looking really nice, but let's say we wanted to add another column so that we can label each of these rows numerically, starting with number 1 at Forerunner. We can come over and select column A, then we can use the shortcut Control Shift plus to add a new column And then if we want to come over here, we can start entering that data kind of the old-fashioned way by just clicking enter and then typing in the numbers ourselves. But if we want to do this quicker, especially if we have a larger data set, there's a few shortcuts that we can use. So let's come over to cell A3, and we're just going to double click on the bottom right hand corner of this cell. And that's going to autofill this entire column with the number 1. But we want these numbers to be counting up. So let's come down here to the bottom right hand corner where we see this icon that says autofill options and click on it. We can change this to a fill series. And now we're going to count up from 1 to 14. And this certainly is not the only option for autofilling in Excel. So let's say we do not like double clicking. Let's go here and let's use an alternative method. Instead, we are going to enter the number 1 into cell A3, and then we're going to come up to the bottom right hand corner of that cell, and we're just going to drag and drop for this entire column. We want this to be a fill series once again, and that has given us the same end result with a drag and drop method for autofill instead of double clicking. But let's say we want this process to happen even more quickly. There's actually one more shortcut that we can use. And this time when we right click on the bottom corner and we start to drag, we're also going to be holding down the control button. And this is going to autofill in an ascending order. Now let's say that we want this order to be reversed and we want these numbers to be descending from 14 down to 1 instead of ascending from 1 to 14. We already have this column selected, so we can come up here in the top ribbon in the Home tab and we can find Sort and Filter. Let's go Sort Largest to Smallest. Now Excel is pretty smart and it notices that we have data next to our selection. Let's go ahead and expand the selection so that when we sort the first column, it's going to sort everything else that's attached to it as well. Now, as you can see, not just column A has been sorted, but every other column that corresponds to A has been sorted as well. But maybe instead of sorting these as descending, we actually just want to hide some of the rows. So let's go ahead and change that sorting order back to smallest to largest. And then we're going to come up here to sort and filter again, and we're going to start filtering these different rows. So that apply to filter, and we know that because at the top of this column, in the very first cell, we see this downward arrow, and we can click on it and decide which of these rows we want to display. So right now they're all selected, but if we want to hide 4 and 5, we can just uncheck those, hit OK. Those two rows are no longer displayed. If we want to add them back, we can just click on the filter icon one more time, and we can come back in and select those boxes and hit OK. Many times in Excel, we're going to want to move data. We're going to want to copy that data and paste it somewhere else. So let's take a look at all of the different options that we have for doing that. And let's say that we want to create a new column that's not just specific to the city where the sales were made, but it has the city and the state. So we can come over here to cell D3 and we can use Control C to copy that data, and then over here to H3 and Control V to paste it in the new column. Now once we've copied that data, it's actually going to save on our clipboard. So if we come up to the top left group here on the Home ribbon and we expand the clipboard, we can see all of the different items that we have either cut or copied in the past. And if we select a cell and then just click on one of these items, it's going to automatically paste it for us. And we can paste from this same clipboard in a different worksheet within the same workbook. So let's say we copied something a while back on a different worksheet. We don't want to go back and recopy it to bring it over to this workbook. So we can just click on the cell that we want to paste our data into and then come over to the clipboard and click on that data to paste the data from another worksheet into our current Excel worksheet. Now let's come back to our formatted data set and look at a couple different ways that we can use copy and paste. So let's say in this new column, column H, we want to add column headers. And we want to keep the formatting that we've been using in these other headers. So if we come over to cell G3, where we have the profit header, we can right click on that cell to copy the contents. Now let's come over to H3, where we want to paste the formatting for our header. Let's right click on the cell and we can see paste options. We have a bunch of different options: a normal paste, pasting the values, pasting the formulas, transposing, and right here, pasting the formatting. So when we select this option, you can see we have the formatting for the fill background, we have the formatting for the border, and when we type in our new column header, let's say we want to name this city state, it's also going to give us the same color text. And now that we have this column header, let's get back to copying over the city names. And in the past, we had done this individually, but let's see about copying this entire column of data. So if we just select the column and then we hit Control C for copy, we can then come back over to column H where we want to paste this data and use Control V to add all of those city names. But let's say that we want to consolidate because we don't want two separate columns that have the cities listed. So instead of copying that data over, we're actually going to cut it and move all of these cities over to the city-state column. So let's use the delete button to get rid of the contents of column H. Then let's come back over to column D, select the entire column, and instead of Control C, we're going to use Control X, which is actually cutting that data. Let's go back over to column H and Control V. As you can see, we have just cut and paste that data into our new column. And then we can come back over to column D, select it, and right click on that column header to delete the column. And we've now consolidated that data into the city-state column where we can easily add a comma and the state abbreviation after each city. I've gone ahead and added the state abbreviations next to the city names in column G. But let's say we want to split up this data into two separate columns so that we have one column for city and another column for state. There's a couple of different ways to do this. The first method that we're going to look at is splitting that data using text to columns. So let's go ahead and select the data that we want to split. And then if we come over to the data tab in the top ribbon, we can see the text to columns button. Let's click on that. And Excel knows that our data is delimited because it's separated by spaces and commas. So we can go ahead and hit next. On this screen, we're going to choose what the delimiters are in our data. And in this example, our data is separated by a comma. So let's click comma, and we can see down here that the preview is already splitting that data up. Now let's go ahead and click next. And on this screen, we can decide the format for our new data. General is going to work just fine, and the destination is cell G3, which is where we were currently starting at. Now we can hit finish, and as you can see, Excel has gone ahead and separated this data for us. But maybe we don't like that method, so let's go ahead and try something else. Let's first use the undo button to return to our original state of data where we have the city and the state in the same column. And then in the same data tab in the top ribbon, we can come over to flash fill. And this is going to detect patterns in our data for us, and Excel is going to continue filling that data based on the pattern. So what we need to do is we need to give Excel a pattern. Let's start by entering Seattle in cell H3. And now that we've given Excel a little bit more info, let's click back into this cell and then come back up to that flash fill button and see what it does. Excel has filled out the rest of this column with just the city names, and it also gave us a new header with just the title city. Pretty impressive. Now let's do the same thing for the state abbreviation column. And if we come over to I3 and type WA, that's the abbreviation for Washington, then we can click back into the cell and do autofill once again. And as you can see, Excel has done most of the heavy lifting for us. But let's say that we want to change the formatting on these column headers to make it look just a little bit prettier. So we've used Control C to copy data from G2, and we want to paste that in both H2 and I2. So let's select those cells and then come over here to the paste drop down menu, and we want to choose other paste options and paste just the formatting. Now these headers are looking really good, but it looks like the border is actually in the middle of these columns and we don't want it there. So let's come up to the border drop down and let's go to erase border and make sure that we have this border erased in here so that it's only around the edges of these columns. One of the most useful tools when we're making edits in Excel is find and replace. Let's take a look at how to use this tool. So we can pull up Find and Replace by using the shortcut Control F on our keyboard, or up in the top ribbon within the Home tab, we can go over to Find and Select. Let's hit Find, and then we can start searching for data within this worksheet or within the entire workbook. So there's a couple things to keep in mind when we're using Find and Replace in Excel. First of all, case does not matter. So it doesn't matter if we're using capitals or lower cases, unless of course we select match case. We can also specify whether or not we want to match the entire cell contents. So let's say, for example, we are searching for all of the cells that include the word Seattle. If we select match entire cell contents, it's only going to pull up results in column H because column G is not going to have any matches with the entire cell contents. Seattle is not an exact match for Seattle, Washington. Now let's say, for example, that we're looking for all of the places in this worksheet where the word Nissan shows up, and we're going to replace that with Toyota because the two recently merged, and going forward, all of these vehicles are going to be under the Toyota name. So let's enter in Nissan. Let's go ahead and search that, find all, and then we can move over to replace and replace that with Toyota. Now when we're ready to make this change, we can hit the replace all button, but I always like to double check and make sure that we're finding the correct values to replace here. Right now this has pulled up 4 different values with Nissan for us, which looks right. So we can go ahead and hit replace all. All done, we made 4 replacements. Now this is going to be extremely useful when we're dealing with large data sets and replacing hundreds of pieces of data at once. And there are a couple more things that I want to go over real quick about find and replace before we move on. So let's first undo these changes because the merger didn't actually happen. And now let's say, for example, that we're searching for data, but we only want to search in a specific column. So if we first highlight column G before we do a find and replace, now we press Control F to bring this up and we search for WA. And for this example, we don't need to match entire cell contents. So let's remove that and then let's hit find all. And as you can see, WA is only pulling up within column G. It's not finding WA in column I because we did not have that column selected before we ran the search. So as you can see, we can really drill down here to find very specific data. If we want, we can even find all of the data within an entire workbook. So find and replace becomes a very powerful tool at our disposal. Let's take a look at how Excel handles formulas. And this is where Excel becomes extremely powerful. So in front of us, we have a modified table with an empty profit column. Let's use a formula to come up with the number for profit. In cell F3, let's enter an equal sign to let Excel know we're using a formula. Then we can manually enter 22,000 multiplied by 6, and that returns 132,000. So while this formula gave us the right number for profit, it's really not harnessing the power of Excel. That's because this formula is not dynamic. We didn't use cell references for cell D3 and cell E3 when we plugged in the numbers for the profit formula. So if we were to copy this formula and bring it down from cell F3 to cell F4, we would just get the same number here. So let's remove this data and try using cell references in this formula to make that formula dynamic. This time, after we enter equals in cell F3, we can then click on cell D3. From here, we can go up to the formula bar, enter the multiply sign, and then click on cell E3. This looks good, so let's hit enter. And as you can see, we get the same number from Excel. But if we click back into that cell, you can see that we have a formula using cell references up here in the formula bar. So now let's see what happens if we right click on the bottom right hand corner of this cell and drag the formula down to autofill this entire column. As you can see, it applied the formula to each cell, but the numbers changed to give us the correct profit for each row. And when we click into cell F4, we can see up in the formula bar that our formula is D4 multiplied by E4. That's a little bit different than our formula in cell F3, which was D3 multiplied by E3. And that's because when we entered this formula, we used relative references for D3 and E3. And that allows Excel to change those cell references each time we move down a row in column F, giving us the correct profit number for each row. Now that we have the profit column filled in, we want to come down and figure out what our total profit is for all of the different car models. There's a few different ways to go about this. And what we're looking for is the sum of this column. So let's start by letting Excel know we're using a formula and enter equals in cell F17. We can then come up to the formula bar and click on the insert function. Now this pulls up the most recently used functions, and we have right here the sum function, which is going to give us the total of all the cells in this column. And before we can run this function, we have to make sure we have the correct function arguments. Excel's pretty smart, so it's going to go ahead and give us a range of numbers where it guesses that we want to find the sum of. And in this case, it happens to be correct. It's given us cell F3 through F16, so we can go ahead and hit OK. As usual in Excel, there are quite a few ways to do things. So let's go ahead and delete the contents of this cell. And now that we have cell F17 still selected, we can come back up here to the top ribbon and just click on the sum function. And because we've entered this function in the first empty cell after a column full of data, Excel is going to guess the range for us, pulling all of the numbers from column F from F3 to F16. This looks great, so we can hit enter. And once again, Excel was able to correctly find the sum of column F. Now let's say that we also want to find the sum of column E. We can just come into column F on cell F17, copy the contents of that cell, which is going to copy the formula, and then we can paste that formula in cell E17. And as you can see, Excel has taken that formula and applied it to E17. And because we were using relative references, Excel knew to take that range of F3 to F16 for the previous formula and change that to E3 to E16 to find the sum of column E. Now, if for some reason we want to paste just the value for the sum of column F, instead of that formula, we can come into cell F17 and use Control-C to copy it like we would otherwise. And then let's say we want to paste that value into G17. We come up to paste in this drop-down menu for paste special and paste just the value. But for this table, we're not actually going to need this value, so let's go ahead and delete it. We do, on the other hand, want to find the sum of column D. So let's come back to column E, let's copy the formula from cell E17 and paste that into cell D17. Now this gives us a scientific number, likely because the width of the column is not the right size. So let's double click on column D, and now we can see that we have the total for that column. In the introduction to calculations, we talked a little bit about the types of cell references. And in that intro, we were using relative references. But what about absolute references and mixed references? Let's look at what these different types of references mean and how to use them in Excel. So for this example, I'm going to clear out the entire profit column except for cell F3. So let's take another look at the formula we currently have entered in cell F3. This is a relative reference. None of these cell references have been locked. If we want to lock these references, we can do so by entering a $sign in front of that reference. So a $sign in front of the D is going to lock us into column D, and a $sign in front of row 3 will lock us in that row. We can do the same thing for column E and row 3 in the second half of the formula. Now let's hit enter to see what happens. We come up with the same profit number as we did originally in cell F3. But when we take this formula and we copy it down to autofill the rest of the rows in column F, we can see that we continue to get the same profit as we did in cell F3. And that's because the formula is not changing as it drops down. All of these references have been locked, and therefore we get the exact same formula and the exact same profit for every single row in column F. Now obviously absolute references are not going to be useful to us in this example. So let's go ahead and delete these contents and let's come back up to cell F3. Now we want to change this back to a relative reference, but instead of deleting these $signs individually to change the cell references, we are going to use the F4 key as a shortcut. And each time we hit F4, it's going to toggle between the different types of cell references. From absolute, it just took us to a mixed cell reference. Now we are at another type of mixed cell reference. And finally, F4 one more time takes us back to a relative reference. And we want to do the same thing on the second half of this formula. So let's hit F4 a few times here as well. And now that we're back to the original formula, let's hit enter here. And we can right click on the bottom corner of this cell, drag it and drop it to apply that formula to the rest of the cells in column F. So let's take a look at an example where an absolute reference is actually going to come in handy in Excel. In our used car sales data table, we've added a commission. And that's the amount that each and every dealership will take when they make a sale. So I want to add a new column to this table, and let's call that net profit. And calculating net profit is going to be simple. We're just going to take the profit from column F, and then we're going to subtract the commission from cell K2. This gives us the correct net profit for cell G3. But what about when we drag this formula down and fill in the other rows in the column? And as we can see, the net profit number for every cell in column G other than G3 is actually incorrect. And that's because while we want to be subtracting cell K2, that's the commission of 2,000, from the profit each time, we used a relative reference in this formula. So each time we copied this formula down one, Excel was actually increasing the row value for K by 1. But we don't have data located anywhere in column K other than cell K2. So we actually want to lock that cell reference in with an absolute reference. Okay, let's clean this up. We're going to remove all of this data, and then we're going to come back up to cell G3, and we're going to make K2 an absolute reference by using the F4 button. We can hit enter and then copy this formula down to the rest of the column. Now the net profit will be calculated in each row by subtracting the commission of 2,000 from the profit in that row. Let's take a look at some formulas in Excel, and formulas are where Excel becomes very powerful. We're going to begin with statistical formulas, specifically the average formula. So we have some data over here in column A, and we're going to run some different averages with that data. Let's start by finding the average for the range of A4 to A6. We can enter equals and start typing average. When we have average pop up, we can just hit tab to go ahead and enter that formula, and Excel can accept a bunch of numbers here, so we could type those out by hand, typing 8, 4, 12, but the real power of Excel is actually using cell references. So instead we are going to click into this range and just select that entire range. That way, if we go back and edit this data and change that in the future, Excel can automatically change those inputs and still give us the average for the range between A4 and A6. So when we return that, we get the result of 8, and that is the average of those three numbers. Now let's find the average for the range of A4 to A7, and instead of typing out that average formula, let's come up here and take a shortcut. By the sum function, we can actually drop down and use the average formula. Now Excel is going to try and guess what we're averaging, but we can go ahead and click into the cells that we actually want to select. And you'll notice here that we have an empty cell in our range. Let's see what Excel returns. And we get the same result. That's because when we use a range that has blanks within it, Excel is just going to ignore those blanks. Okay, so let's run one more average here, and this time we're going to do it for the range of A4 to A8. And when we select these cells, notice that cell A8 has a 0 in it. So let's see how Excel is going to deal with this. And as you can see, 0 was actually accounted for in these averages. So Excel took the average between 8, 4, 12, and 0. Keep that in mind when you're using the average formula in Excel. Zeros are going to be included in that data. Let's take a look at the average if function, and we're going to be using the data in columns A and B. So the average if function is going to take a few different arguments. It's looking for a range, the criteria, and then the average range. So the range we're going to select here is B4 to B7. Let's go ahead and highlight those cells. Then we're going to enter a comma. And what's the criteria that we're using for this formula? We only want to average the cells where we have the name Ryan. So let's enter that within quotes and then enter a comma as well. So the last argument that Excel is looking for is the average range, and this is the data that we want to be averaging. If we do not enter an average range, Excel is going to assume it was the same as the range. And now that we've entered all the arguments, we can close this out with a parentheses and hit enter. This gives us a result of 10, which is the average of all of the data under Ryan's name. Well, let's do a quick recap of how the arguments within the average if function work. So within the range of B4 to B7, we are looking for all of the cells where the name is Ryan. And if the name is Ryan, then we're going to be taking the average of the corresponding cells from A4 to A7. So we're just applying the average of cell A6 and cell A4, and when we add those together and divide by 2, we get 20 divided by 2, which gave us the result of 10. Now let's use the average if formula to find the average of the range A4 to A6 if the number in those cells is greater than 5. So in this case, we're going to give a range and the criteria, and because our range and the average range are the same, we're actually going to leave out that third argument. So for the range, let's select a 4 to a 6, and then we're going to enter a comma. Now within quotations, we're going to enter greater than 5. Let's close this out with the parentheses and then hit enter. And as you can see, the average once again is 10. And this is because we've taken the average of cell A4 and A6, 8 plus 12, and divided it by 2. We've ignored cell A5 because that cell was less than 5. Let's take a look at different types of count functions. In this exercise, we're going to look at count, count A, count blank, and count if. The count function counts the number of cells in a range that have a number in them. So within the range A4 to A8, we're going to count the cells that actually have a number in them. And let's go ahead and select this range over here in column A, and then hit enter. Notice that Excel counted 3 cells within this range that have a number in them. Now, if you remember back to our earlier lesson, you remember that Excel keeps track of dates as numbers. So 11/20/2020 is actually recorded as the number of days since January 1st, 1900, the reason why Excel returned 3 numbers within this range from A4 to A8. Now let's use count A to count the number of cells that are not empty in the range of A4 to A8. So let's go ahead and select this range once again, and then we can go ahead and close this out with the parentheses and hit enter. We will find that 4 cells in this range are not empty. The only cell that is actually empty is cell A5. And now let's use count blank to count the number of blank cells within the range of A4 to A8. So let's go ahead and select this range one more time. We can hit a parentheses and then press enter. And this gives us 1 blank cell, which is about what we expected from taking a look at this data. Now, one thing that's interesting about the count blank and the count A formulas is that if we come in here to cell A5 and we enter equals, and then we just use a parentheses, but leave the inner contents of that parentheses blank and hit enter, you can see that count A changes to 5. We've now counted 5 cells that are not empty. Cell 5 is now counted as not empty because technically we made an entry in that cell, but the entry was a blank entry, so Excel is still counting 1 blank within this range. And last but not least, let's use the COUNTIF function to count the number of cells within the range A4 to A8 that have a number greater than 4 in them. So once we've selected that range, we can hit comma, and then we can use quotations to make sure that we select only numbers that are greater than 4 within that range. And we can go ahead and close that out with the parentheses and then hit enter. And we find that 2 numbers are greater than 4 in this range. Now, taking a look at this range, on first impression, it only looks like one of those numbers, number 8, is greater than 4. But if we remember back that dates are actually counted as numbers, beginning at January 1st, 1900, we realize that November 20th, 2020 is actually going to be a really big number. Let's confirm that by going up to formatting and changing this to general. Now I can see why Excel has returned 2 for this formula. The last statistical formulas that we're going to cover are max and min. Max is going to return the maximum number in a range, and min is going to return the minimum number in that range. Let's start by finding the maximum number in the range of cells A4 to A7, so we can select those cells, then close this out with the parentheses and hit enter, and that returns 23 because 23 is the maximum number in that range. Now let's take a look at what happens when we run the max formula for a range of cells that includes an error. We're going to take a look at the range of A4 to A8, and in cell A8 we currently have an error. So when we enter this formula in Excel, it actually returns an error, and that's because when we use a min or a max function in Excel and the range includes a cell with an error, that formula is going to return an error. Let's now take a look at the min function, and we're going to use the range of A4 to A7 for this formula. And Excel is going to give us the min of this range, which is 2. And we're going to use this min formula one more time, and this time on the range of cells from A4 to A8. But before we run this, let's delete the contents of cell A8 so that it is now a blank cell. And now when we enter this min function, Excel is going to ignore that blank cell within our range and give us the min of all other non-empty cells within that range. In this case, that's 2. Let's take a look at how to use math formulas within Excel. We're going to start with the sum function, which we already touched on earlier in calculations intro, but we're going to look at a few different use cases for this function. So let's first take a look at the sum function, and when it pops up here, we can hit tab to auto-complete that function. Now let's enter the sum for the range of A4 to A7. And first we're going to click individually into each of these cells, hit a comma to add that, and then click to the next cell. And when we've added each of these cells to our formula, we can close it out with a parentheses and then hit enter to find the sum of those cells. Now the faster way to do this would be to actually come in here, and instead of entering them individually, it would be to actually just select the entire range and then hit enter, and that gives us the same result. Now let's say, for example, that we want to find the sum of a range, and then we also want to add in another number or another cell that may not be contiguous. So it's not next to that range. We can't select them all in the same group, but we still want to add it. In this example, we're using A7, but think of it as if we were using J7, and we could not select J7 within the same selection range as A4 to A6. So what we can do is, once we enter in the sum formula here, hit tab to auto-complete that. We can select the range from A4 to A6, then hit comma, and individually select another cell here to add that into our sum formula. Let's hit enter, and of course it comes up with the same result as our initial sum formula because we are still adding the same cells. Now let's take a look at a couple different ways that we can enter arguments into the sum formula. So you can see here in our last sum formula that we've entered 5 as text anytime we use quotes within a formula. That tells Excel that it's text. We've then entered 2 just as a normal integer. We've also selected cell A5, and then we've entered false. So Excel reads true and false as 1 and 0 in Excel, and Excel is going to read false as 0 in this case. So let's go ahead and enter that by selecting the sum formula here, hitting tab to auto-complete that, and then entering these arguments in our formula. And once we've entered those, we can close the parentheses and then hit enter. And Excel has converted our text string of 5 into the number 5. It's added 2 to that to get to 7. And then cell A5, which has a value of 4, added to 7 gives us 11. False, of course, is read as a 0. So we remain at a total of 11 for the sum of these cells. Let's take a look at the SUMIF function in Excel. And it's going to work in a similar fashion to the average if function, except of course it's taking the sum instead of the average of a range of cells. So in this example, we're going to cover what it would look like if we wanted to take the sum of cells within the range of A4 to A7, assuming that the corresponding cells in B4 to B7 have the letter N somewhere in the name. So if we pull up the SUMIF function, we can hit equals SUMIF, and once we click on it, hit tab to auto-populate that. Then we're going to select the range, so B4 to B7, and we're checking within this range for the criteria of the letter N. And then let's select the range that we want to sum. We can close this out with the parentheses and then hit enter. And if we look in the range from B4 to B7, we can see that Ryan, and Noah all have the letter N, and the sum of their corresponding cells in the A column is 25. The int function in Excel is going to take a number and it's going to return just the integer portion of that number. So as we can see here in cell A4, we have 17.2, the integer being 17 and the decimal being 2. So when we come over here and we enter the formula for int, we can select it, hit tab to autocomplete, and then select cell A4 where we have our number 17.2, and we'll see that Excel is going to return the result of 17. It's only taking the integer here, it's ignoring that decimal, so it doesn't matter if we come back in here and change that decimal to 0.9, Excel is still going to give us 17. So let's look at how integers work with negative numbers in Excel, and they're a little bit different. because when we have a negative number, Excel is actually going to round away from 0 and return a negative integer. So 6.1 is actually going to be rounded up to 7 and returned as a negative 7. Let's enter this here. And as we can see, once we've selected cell A5, close that parentheses and hit enter, that Excel is returning a negative 7 because it rounded away from 6 and returned it as a negative number. Let's take a look at some logic formulas in Excel. For starters, we'll begin with or, and, not. Now the or formula is going to take a look at two arguments, and if at least one of those is true, it will return true. If both are false, it's going to return false. So let's take a look at this first formula. We're going to say equals, type in or, then we can hit tab to autocomplete that. And the first statement is going to be true. So let's go ahead and click on the true value in cell A4. And then the second argument here is false. So let's close that out with a parentheses, hit enter, and that returns true because one of them was true. Now we have false and 0. And Excel is going to recognize 0 as false. So when we enter the or formula, let's go ahead and select cell A5 for false. And then we're going to enter 0, close that out with a parentheses once more, and hit enter. And as we can see, that returns false because both of those arguments were false within the formula. And now let's see what happens if both arguments within an or formula are true. So we can go back in here and just edit the arguments that we already had. Instead of A5, both of these arguments are going to be A4. Let's hit enter. And it still returns true because at least one of the arguments within this formula was true. Now let's take a look at the and formula, and this is checking if all of the arguments are true, and it's going to return true if all the arguments are true. If you ever get confused about what a formula is going to give us as a result, you can always read the little dialogue that Excel gives us, as it gives us a great description of what that formula is going to do. So now that we are sure we want to use the and formula, let's hit tab. And then we're going to enter true, and we're just going to type true in. And let's hit tab to select true, and then separate with a comma. And now let's type in false, and once again hit tab, close that out with a parentheses, and then hit enter. And of course, Excel is going to return false because both of these arguments were not true. Let's use the and formula one more time. And this time, the first argument that we're going to enter, I'm going to enter a logical argument myself. So let's go ahead and pull up the and formula, hit tab, and we're going to be checking to see if 7 is less than 10. So let's go ahead and enter that within quotes, and then we're going to hit comma, and we're going to go ahead and follow that up with our second argument, which is true. We can select that by hitting tab to autocomplete. Then let's close out those parentheses, and Excel is going to return this as true because both of our arguments were decided to be true. Finally, let's take a look at the not formula. This checks whether the argument is true or false that we've entered within the formula, and then it returns the opposite. So if we enter true within our formula, it returns false. And if we enter false, it's going to return true. So in our first not formula, we're going to find not 0. And remember that Excel reads zeros as false, so this is going to return true. And in our final not formula, we're going to check not true. So we can go ahead and just select true cell A4 over here, use that cell, and then close out the parentheses. And of course, this returns false. The next two formulas we're going to take a look at are if formulas and if error formulas. So first, let's take a look at if formulas. And in an if formula, we are checking if a condition is met. If that condition is true, then the value that we decide to enter for true will appear. And if it's false, then the value that we decide to enter for false will appear. So let's see what this looks like. And we're going to pull up the if formula, hit tab to autocomplete that. The logical test is if A4 is greater than A5. So let's go ahead and enter that. And let's select A5. We can hit a comma. Now we enter a value for true. And we want to say yes if that's true. Then if it's false, we want to say no. And of course, these are in quotations because this is text that we're entering. Now let's close this out with the parentheses and hit enter. And as we can see, we return a yes because A4 is greater than A5. But let's see what happens if we don't have an argument for whether this is false. So we're going to say yes if it's true, but we're not going to have an argument for whether it's false. And this is going to return the same answer because of course it was true. But let's say that we switch this around and we're checking if A4 is less than A5. And now, without this value for false, it's going to return false. And that's the default value that Excel is going to return in an if statement if we do not choose our own value for false. Okay, so let's move on to if-error formulas. And if errors are nice because they clean up our Excel worksheets. It's kind of ugly to have a bunch of errors sitting in an Excel worksheet. So what if error does is it checks if there's an error in the formula that we enter. And if there is an error, it's going to return a value of our choice. So in this first formula, we were checking if we can divide A4 by A5. We're going to return the value of A4 divided by A5. But if that gives an error, we're going to instead return fix. So let's go ahead and enter this formula. We can start typing it in, and then we can autocomplete with tab. Now let's go ahead and select cell A4, and then let's hit divide, and let's select A5. We'll now enter a comma, and then the value if error is going to be fix with a capital F. Let's close that out with quotations, and then use a parentheses. Let's hit enter, and you can see that the value here returned is 5 because there was no error in that formula. But let's try another formula. So let's go ahead and use the if error formula once again. We can scroll down, hit tab to autocomplete that, and we're going to be dividing A6 by A5. So let's enter that, select cell A5, use a comma, and once again, the value if error is going to be fix. Okay, let's close that out. We can then hit enter, and Excel is going to return the value fix. That's because when we entered the formula for A6 divided by A5, that divided blue by 2, which returned an error. The right, left, and mid formulas in Excel are going to come in handy when we want to isolate and return just a portion of data within a cell in an Excel worksheet. So let's see how this would work. Let's say we want to find just the area code from this phone number. We can use the left function here. So let's enter equals and then start typing left. We can hit tab to autocomplete that. And first let's select the text where we're going to be applying this left formula. We can hit comma and then the number of characters that we want to return. That's just the first 3 for the area code. Let's then use a parentheses to close this out and hit enter. And the result is 425. Let's use the left formula again, this time to grab the first 5 characters. So for the first argument, we're going to target the text in cell A4 once again. But for the second argument, now the number of characters is 5. And Excel is going to return 425 space 8 for the first 5 characters. Notice that Excel is counting the blank space as a character when using the left formula. Let's use the left formula one more time. And for the first argument, we're going to target the same text, that's cell A4, but for the second argument, this time for the number of characters, we're going to enter 15. And when the number of characters that we specify is greater than the length of the data that we're selecting, Excel is just going to return the entire data in that cell. Let's use the right formula to grab the last 3 digits of this phone number. So for the first argument, we just target the text, which once again is cell A4. And then for the second argument, we decide the number of characters. That's going to be 3. We'll close the formula out with a parentheses and then hit enter. Excel is going to return 690. Now let's use the mid function to isolate 3 digits in the middle of this phone number, 891. So with the mid function, the first argument, we are specifying the text that we target. Once again, that's going to be A4. For the second argument, we specify the start number, and we want to start 5 characters in. 4 characters in would be the space right before 891, but we want to start on that 8. So let's enter 5. And then for the last argument, we specify the number of characters that we want to select. That's going to be 3. We can close this formula out with the parentheses and then hit enter. And Excel is going to return 891. When looking for the length of data in a cell, the len formula is going to be very useful. So let's start by finding the length of the data that we have in cell A4. We can pull up the len formula. Let's search for it, scroll down one, hit tab to enter it, and then let's just highlight the text where we're looking for the length. Let's close the parentheses here and hit enter. And as we can see, this is 12 digits, and that's including the spaces in that cell. So what if instead of selecting a cell, we just want to find the length of the word phone? We can search for the length formula one more time. Once we've selected it, hit tab to autocomplete. And then let's enter this text in here. Let's use quotes, and then let's type in phone, close it out, and hit enter. And it looks like we have an error here. That's probably because one of our quotations is a single quote instead of a double quote, so let's fix that. And as we can see, the length of phone is 5. Now, if we come in here and we change that, we add a space after phone, that's going to instead return 6 because once again, that space is counted. When we have text in our worksheet and it's not in the correct case, the upper, lower, and proper formulas can really help us out. So let's say that we want to start with taking cell A5, which currently is in all lower cases, and we want to automatically change that into all upper cases. We can use the upper function and we can select cell A5, then let's hit a parentheses, hit enter, and as we can see, that returns us Wednesday in all caps. Now let's say we want to take cell A6, which is already in all caps, but we want to change that into lowercase. We can enter the lower formula and then select cell A6 and hit enter, and that's going to give us Thursday in all lowercase. But what about when our text is just all over the place, it's in the wrong cases, and we just want it to be normal, the proper cases? Well, in this scenario, we can use the proper formula. We're going to search for it, and once we have it pulled up, we can autocomplete with the tab button, and let's go ahead and select A4 for this example. Let's close this out with the parentheses and hit enter. And as you can see, Friday is now entered with just the first letter capitalized. So in 3 different scenarios, we were able to change the cases of the letters within our cells using upper, lower, and proper. Let's take a look at the VLOOKUP formula, and this formula is going to be extremely useful when we're looking for a value in a very large table. So the best way to demonstrate how this works is going to be to pull up the VLOOKUP formula. Let's hit tab, and let's take a look at what the arguments are that it accepts. So the first argument is the lookup value, and we're going to be searching for JETA, so let's go ahead and enter that in here. And then where are we looking for JETA? What's the table array? So we're going to select the table array, which in this case is going to be cell A5 to D18, and that's this entire table. So it's important that the lookup value is in the leftmost column of that table array that you select. It has to be in this column for VLOOKUP to work, and JETA is in that far left column, so we're good to go. We can move on. Let's hit comma. And what's the column index that we're searching for a value in? We want to look at the sales price of that JETA, and that's going to be in column C, which is in the 3rd column index. So let's hit 3, then we can use another comma to move on, and here's where we decide if we want an approximate match or an exact match. And usually we're going to want an exact match, so let's type in false, or we can just click on it here in the list and then hit tab. Then we can close this out with a parentheses and hit enter. And as we can see, VLOOKUP has found 13,500 for the sales price of that JETA in this table. And if this were a much larger table, it would be very valuable for us to use this formula instead of just scrolling through things ourselves. So in this next formula, we're going to be running a VLOOKUP again, but this time, instead of looking for the sales price of that JETA, we're going to look for how many JETAs were sold, and that's in the 4th column. So we're going to take the same inputs that we used for this last VLOOKUP, and instead of looking in the column index of 3, we're going to be looking in the column index of 4. So let's go ahead and enter that data. Okay, now that we've input those arguments, we can go ahead and press enter. And as we can see, VLOOKUP found 12 for us. That's the number of JETAs that were sold at the $13,500 price. And maybe you're wondering, when would we ever use VLOOKUP with a true argument instead of a false argument? So let's do an example here. Let's say we're looking for a car with the closest price to $20,000 without being actually $20,000. So essentially we want to search for $20,000 in the C column, but we don't actually have any cars that are selling for $20,000. So instead we're pulling up the next most expensive car. And we can do that with VLOOKUP. We can search for it here and hit tab to autocomplete that. The lookup value is 20,000, and then the table array is just this C column. And since it's a one column table array, we are satisfying that need for the lookup value to be in the far leftmost column of that table array. It also means that the column index is going to be 1 because there's only one column in this table array. And when we're checking for an approximate match in this column, it's important that that column is in ascending order, which it is. So we can go ahead and hit tab to make that true and press enter. And it looks like we made a mistake here. So let's go ahead and pull that open to see what it might have been. And it looks like we entered 2,000 instead of 20,000. So let's go ahead and put an extra 0 in there and then hit enter. And as we can see, we pulled up 19,400, which was the next most expensive car sales price. The HLOOKUP formula is going to be very similar to VLOOKUP, except that it's a little bit less commonly used because we're searching for values horizontally in a table. So if we have a table like this that's very wide, or even something much wider where we cannot see all of the different values, we're going to use HLOOKUP. So let's see what that looks like by entering equals and then searching for HLOOKUP. We have it here, so we can hit tab. And the arguments accepted in this formula are very similar to VLOOKUP. So first we're going to want to enter the lookup value, which is going to be Jetta once again. Now for the table array, we're going to go ahead and use our cursor to select that table. And then instead of specifying the column index number, we're now specifying the row index number. And we're looking for data in the third row because that's where the sales prices are located at. And once again, we want an exact match, so we're going to enter false for the range lookup. Let's hit tab here, and let's close this out with a parentheses and hit enter. And Excel has returned 13,500, which is the sales price for the Jetta that's located in the third row for column C. There are quite a few common errors that are going to pop up when we are entering data in Excel. And the more often that you see these errors, the easier it's going to be to identify them and to resolve them. So let's look at a few of the most common errors that are going to pop up, and let's see how we can fix those errors. So the first error that we have here is div by 0. Essentially, Excel is telling us, if we look here in the error box, that the formula or function used is dividing by 0 or empty cells. And that's pretty clear when we look at this formula because we are taking cell D2 and dividing that by E3, which is a blank cell. We can't do that. So if we want to fix this, we have to divide D2 by a cell that actually has some sort of number in it. And we can choose any of the cells in column D because those all have numbers in it. Let's choose D6, hit enter, and now we have 16 instead of an error. But what if we see the value error in Excel? Excel is telling us here that a value used in the formula is of the wrong data type, so we are trying to divide D2 by B3. And instead of dividing 400 by a blank cell, we are trying to divide 400 by a last name, which of course Excel can't do. So once again, we can fix this by dividing by another number instead. And this gives us 4.21. Anytime we enter unrecognized text in a formula in Excel, the name error is going to pop up. So let's take a look at the formula we used up here. And as you can see, we used VLOOKUP. Now, when we entered the lookup value in this formula, we entered Watkins, which is the last name of one of our customers. But when we entered that text value, we did not use quotes around that value. And so Excel is not able to recognize that as a text value because those quotes are required anytime we're entering a text value within a formula. So when we go and fix that, we've resolved the error. Now, anytime I'm in Excel and I'm entering a text value, if possible, I like to just use a cell reference instead. And that's going to get rid of any unwanted data entry errors. And it's also going to do one more thing. Let's say we're making updates to this spreadsheet and we change the last name of one of our customers to Whitener. Now, as you can see, this does not return an error where we have the VLOOKUP formula in cell J2. But if instead we were to enter this as a text value and we enter Watkins, we can see that this is now an NA error because previously Watkins was available in C2, but now that we've updated the data in that cell, Excel can no longer find that value. The NA error is going to pop up anytime a value is not available to the formula or function. So let's take a look in this VLOOKUP formula and see what we did wrong. And if you can remember from when we talked about VLOOKUP previously, the lookup value that we enter has to be in the far left column of the table array that we select. So we selected C2 to D14, but that lookup value is in A4. So if we want this formula to work correctly, we have to change this lookup value to something within the table array and in that far left column of the table array. So let's get rid of A4, and instead we're going to select a value from the C column here. Let's use Smith, and then let's hit enter. And as you can see, that error is now gone. When we start to get a little bit more advanced in Excel while we're working with formulas, we may be combining formulas. And in cell I9, we've done just that. We've combined multiple average formulas in order to come up with a solution. But one of those formulas has an error. So how do we figure out which one it is? This is where we can start to do some debugging, and there's a couple very useful tools for that. So if we come up in the top ribbon, go to the Formulas tab, and then come over to Formula Auditing, we can hit Evaluate Formula. And this is going to break up the formula into different steps and audit them individually. So let's audit the first average in this formula. And as you can see, it gives us the answer here, which is 317.5. There's no error in that portion of the formula. Now, if we hit Evaluate again, we can see that we have the div by 0 error here. So that means that we need to come back into the second part of this formula and resolve that error. So we can go ahead and hit close here, and then we can come into that formula, and we can see that the average of C5 to C7 is what is giving us the issue. And when we look at the C column, the issue here is very apparent. We are trying to divide names, and Excel sees this as a divide by 0 situation. So we need to target numbers in that part of the formula if we want to resolve it. And there's one more trick that we can use to easily debug this formula. Instead of going to the Formulas tab and evaluating that formula, we can simply click into it and we can highlight a portion of that formula. So here we're gonna highlight the average of D2 to D3, and we're just gonna hit F9. And that is going to evaluate it for us. So as we can see, this part of the formula looks good. Now let's move on and let's select just the second portion of that formula, and then let's hit F9 once again. And as we can see, this is where the error is popping up. So we know that we need to fix that part of the formula. Let's hit Control Z, and instead of the averages of C5 to C7, let's come back in here and let's change that to D4 to D5 and then hit enter. Now this formula returns a normal number without any errors. In this worksheet, we have a data set that is in tabular form. Technically, this is not an Excel table. Now, if we make this an Excel table, it's going to come with a ton of functionality that's going to make our lives a lot easier. So let's take a look at everything that we can do with an Excel table. Now, if we want to make this data a table, we can simply select everything here, and then we can either hit Control T or we can go to Insert and click on Table. Now it's going to pop up this dialog box, and we're going to confirm that we want to make the table with this range. That looks good, and we have headers already entered up here, so we're going to keep this box checked where it says My Table has headers. Then we hit OK, and as you can see, the formatting here has changed. We have some different colors in the rows, and up here we have a sort and filter option built in to every single column header, which is going to come in handy. In the bottom right hand corner here, there's a little arrow icon, and we can easily extend this table out. It's going to automatically add a row for us. If we want to get rid of that extension, we can just come back and drop it back in. We can also extend it down here. And each time we extend it down, Excel is going to add another row for us. But let's keep the same data for now, and let's look at a few other things Excel is going to do for us now that we are officially an Excel table. So let's say we come into the A column and we add a new customer ID and then hit enter. Excel has automatically made this into a new row for us. So if we do this one more time and hit enter, as you can see, we've added 2 new rows. Every time we add data to this table, Excel is going to expand that table. So when we start entering formulas and changing data, adding new data, Excel is going to process all of that automatically, which is going to save us quite a few headaches as we build out this data set. So let's say for now that we don't actually want these rows, so we can go ahead and delete that data that we just entered, and then we can grab the corner here and just drag that back up. But let's say what we do want is we want to add another column over here, and we have the balance, but let's say that all of these customers have late fees. So we're going to type in new balance and then hit enter. And as you can see, Excel has given us a new column with the header of new balance. So what we want to do is we want to hit equals here, and we want to run a formula. So we're going to take the balance from column D, and as you can see, it says at balance here. Then we're going to say plus 20. And Excel knows to autofill this entire column with that new formula, because as we're in table format, it knows that these values are related. Pretty handy. And there's quite a bit we can do with the table design if we come up here to this new tab that Excel provides once we have made this a table format. And as you can see, we can come in here and easily remove duplicates. We can convert to a range. So let's say that we no longer want this to be a table. Maybe we made some edits, but we want to revert to just a normal data set or a range. Then we can select this all and hit convert to a range. And we're going to say yes. And as you can see, it removed the filter and sort. It still has a lot of that formatting, but if we want, we can come back and edit that. Let's say we want to clear formatting. So we come to this eraser and just clear formats. And now we're essentially back to what we had before we made this a table. But let's hit Control Z a couple of times and bring this back to table format. So let's click inside, go back to table design, and let's play around with this table just a little bit more. We can remove the header by clicking this button. Don't want to do that. We can add a total row, which is going to total up the last column here. Currently we have banded rows selected. If we remove that, it removes some of the formatting, but I really like those. First column is going to bold the first column. Last column will bold the last column. Banded columns, some people like this. Personally, I don't. And then unchecking the filter button is going to remove those filters. Now let's say we want to give our table a fresh look. I like the orange here, so let's click on the orange table style. A couple other cool things that the table design tab can do is it allows us to summarize with a pivot table. We're going to get into that later. We can change the table name. Let's say we want to name it sales. Just hit sales and then enter. Now we've changed that name. And when we're selecting ranges within this table, Excel is going to look at it a little bit differently than it had in the past. So let's come over here to G4, hit equals, and then let's say we want to select all of the data in this table. Excel knows that this table is called sales, so it's going to pop up with a little dialog box here and show us that this is a table called sales. Let's say we select the entire sales table with the headers as well. Now this says sales all. What if we want to select just a single column from this table? The B column. So this is now referred to as sales #all, comma, the name column. If we select 2 columns instead of 1, the format's going to change, and we're going to get a semicolon after the name column, and the additional column is then listed after that. So this is the new formatting that we're going to be seeing when we select tables and rows of tables and certain cells within tables once we have converted to an Excel table. And it's going to be really easy to work with. If you don't want to remember how to type this out, you can always just select the ranges and Excel is going to label that for you. And there are a few other things that we can do with this table, very similar to what we did with previous data sets that were in tabular form. So let's go ahead and delete the selection right here. And if we want to add a new column, simply click on that column, right click, hit insert, and it's going to put a column to the left of that. We can do the same for rows, highlight row 5 if we want to add a new row, and then hit insert, and that's added a new row for us. But right now we don't actually need that new row. Let's hit Control Z, and let's say we want to copy this table. We can just select the whole thing, hit Control C, and then come over to the new cell where we want this table to start and hit Control V. Now the formatting is a little off. We can use our shortcut Alt-HOI, and as we can see, we now have our table located to the right. Let's say we wanted to put a pivot chart or something in over here. That'd be a good reason to move that table over. And once you get a feel for how to use tables in Excel, it's going to be really easy to build off of those tables with slicers and pivot tables, which we're going to cover in upcoming lessons. If we want to organize data in a very user-friendly way, slicers are going to come in handy. And they're made available to us once we have formatted data as an Excel table. So let's come up here to Table Design, and we can click on the Insert Slicer button. This lets us decide which column we want to use as a slicer. So I think it's going to be very interesting to slice this data by state. I'm going to hit OK. And let's decide which state we want to view. So if we click on California, it's going to display only California's data. If we want to come up and view multiple states at the same time, we can select this multi-select button at the top here, and now we can see California and Florida data at the same time. And the great thing about slicers is that we can toggle between this data in a very user-friendly manner. So if you notice in the data up top here on the state column, the filter button has been applied. So every time we change this data within the slicer, that's actually going to change the filter. Now, once we've selected all of these states, you can see that filter has been removed because we're currently displaying all data. And if we come in here into the filter and we deselect Florida and hit OK, that change is going to be automatically applied to the slicer. So this is really just allowing us to have a more user-friendly way to filter and slice our data. And if we want to, we can apply multiple slicers at the same time. So let's click back into this table, go up to Table Design, and insert a new slicer. And let's say we also want to slice on whether these customers are current. So we can hit OK, bring up that slicer, and let's say we only want to look at current customers. So we're going to do current, we're going to hit Y, and then we're going to come to just the state of California to look at who are our current customers in California. And then maybe we want to see the customers that we've lost. These were past customers in that state. Maybe it's a really profitable state for us, and we want to focus some energy on winning these customers back. We can do this for all of the different states. Let's say we want to select just one at a time. And so now we have single select on. Here's the one customer that we lost in Florida. And here are the two customers we lost in the state of New York. So there's a lot that we can do to change the design and play with the settings of this slicer once we've added it. And when we have that slicer selected, it's going to pull up this slicer tab. From here we can change the styles. Let's say we want to change it to orange to match that table. We can do that there, or maybe we want it to pop and stand out, so we change it to green, and that really differentiates it. We can come into the slicer caption and change the name of that, but I think that current is a really good title for it. We can bring it forward or send it back if there's other objects in our screen that we want it to be on top of or below. We can change the columns, the height, the width, all the dimensions here, or we can just drag and drop to change those ourselves. And if we right click on the slicer and go down to slicer settings, we can also toggle here with some different settings. We can once again change the name of that header. We can hide that header if we want. I always like to keep it displayed. Let's change this to descending order, and that's just going to change the order right here. And now the N is on the bottom instead of on top. And you can play around with all of these settings yourself, but as a base, we've really covered everything that you need to know to dive in to slicers and start using them as a more user-friendly option, as opposed to always filtering your data and coming in here and clicking in and out of that filter every time you want to make a change. One of the most powerful new features that Excel has added is the Analyze Data feature, and you're going to see it up here in the Home tab on the very far right corner of the screen. There's this Analyze Data button. Now currently we have our data set formatted in an Excel table, but Analyze Data is going to work regardless of whether we are in a table format or we just have a normal data set in front of us. And it's going to give us a ton of meaningful ideas based upon this data in the form of pivot charts and pivot tables. So let's go ahead and click this button. As we can see, Excel's analyzing this data, and below it has Discover Insights. So we can scroll down and see all of the different charts and tables that Excel has provided for us based upon our data. It's guessing what the meaningful data points are, and it's providing charts and tables based upon those. So we have here balance by current and state. Essentially, that's showing us the different states, what their balances are, and it's dividing those balances into current and past customers based upon the C column here. I think this is pretty useful, and if we scroll down a little bit further, you can see that this is also provided to us in chart format. And so we can see here, just based upon this, that Florida has a very large portion of current balance and it's larger than any other state, so that might actually be really useful for us. If we want to, we can click on Insert Pivot Chart, and that's going to place this pivot chart in a new sheet for us. Now if we scroll all the way down here to the bottom, we can click on Show All 21 Results, and that expands these results and lets us really drill down into what Excel is giving us via the Analyze Data tab. But let's say that we still have questions, maybe we haven't seen the insights that we were hoping for in the pivot charts and pivot tables that Excel has provided. We can come back up here to the top, and there's a bar here to ask a question about your data. And when we are asking questions here, really what's important is that we're asking them based upon the column headers. So what we're going to look for is new balance, and we want that to be organized by state. So we're just going to type in new balance by state and hit enter. And then Excel has pulled up a pivot chart for us, and it shows us the new balances by state, of which Washington has the largest. So we don't actually have to enter this in question format. We just have to be using the column headers when we're typing anything in this box up here for Excel to give us any kind of meaningful data. And let's say we really like this pivot chart, so let's go ahead and insert it. Excel is going to create a new sheet for us with this chart, and there's a lot we can do here, but we have a later lesson on pivot charts and pivot tables, so I'm going to save some of that for that lesson. Conditional formatting is going to be very useful when we are showing trends in our data and highlighting important values. So within the Home tab of our top ribbon up here, we have a Conditional Formatting drop-down menu. And let's say we want to apply conditional formatting to the new balance column. So let's select all of this data and then come up to Conditional Formatting. Here we can see all of the different options that we have to format our cells. Let's start from the top. We can highlight cells that are greater than, less than, between, or equal to. We can also highlight text that contains a date that occurs, or duplicate values, which can be very useful if we're trying to pinpoint where these values are within our data set. But let's look at greater than. So the default value here that Excel gives us is going to be 461.5. Let's say we want to change that around and we want to find any values greater than 500. So now we've highlighted the top 3 values in our column, all of which are greater than 500, and we're currently filling those with a light red fill and a dark red text, but we could do just a light red fill, we could do just a red text, we could do yellow fill, or even green fill. In general, if I'm using conditional formatting to highlight cells that I think communicate something positive, I like to use a green fill. On the other hand, if it highlights something negative, I use a red fill. So let's say in this example that balance, the higher balance, means those customers are high spending customers, and this is a good thing. So let's stick with that green fill, let's hit OK, and now we have applied this conditional formatting to those cells. But let's say that we want to remove this formatting, we want to try something else out. We can go down to Clear Rules within the Conditional Formatting drop-down menu and hit Clear Rules from selected cells. Now this allows us to go back in here and figure out what else we want to do to format these cells. So Excel has some built-in rules for conditional formatting, and let's say we want to highlight just the cells that are below an average. So Excel is going to take the average of that entire column and then just highlight those values that are below that average. So let's go ahead and hit this, and as you can see, it's already displaying a light red fill with a dark text. I like this because values that are below average are generally a bad thing, so let's display that with a red fill. Now maybe instead of just showing the cells that are below average, we want to show how these values relate to each other. So let's go ahead and clear that rule, and then let's come back into the conditional formatting dropdown. We can see we also have data bars. That's going to essentially display a bar chart within that column, and we can change the colors here. We can change it from gradient fill to solid fill. I really do love using data bars, but for what we're currently trying to do, I think that color scales might be a little bit more interesting. So as we can see, we have green, white, and red on this color scale. We can go ahead and apply that, and just by looking at it, you see that the higher values are in green, the middle values are a whiter color, and then the low values are a red. But what exactly are these colors telling us? Let's come into conditional formatting. Let's go to manage rules, and we can see that we have this one rule that we currently have applied to our column. Let's get in there, let's edit rule, and as you can see, the midpoint is the 50th percentile, and that's displayed in white. Everything higher than that's in green, and everything lower is in red. This looks good, so let's go ahead and hit OK. And we can go ahead and close out of here since we're not making any changes. But let's say maybe we still think this looks a little bit confusing. The colors are kind of Christmassy. They might not communicate what we are trying to show with this data as well as it could. So let's go ahead and make sure this is selected. Let's clear that formatting down here under clear rules, and then let's come back up to conditional formatting and let's use icon sets. So directional are some of my favorite. As you can see, we are displaying the same patterns within this data as we were with color scales, but now we also have arrows, and instead of those middle values being white, they're now yellow. So this is really something that resonates with anyone that drives a car, because these are correlated with traffic colors. And if we drop down even further, the shapes are going to be similar to traffic lights as well. And they're going to display green for top values, yellow for middle values, and red for those low values. So I really like directional because it's really hard to miss what we're trying to show with this. This is going to be super useful in communicating the trends in our data. Now, as always in Excel, there are multiple ways of doing this. So let's highlight these values. Let's come up here. Let's clear that formatting one more time. And while these values are still highlighted, at the bottom right-hand corner here, we have quick analysis. If we click on that, the first tab here is going to be a formatting tab. We can scroll through here without actually clicking on any of these formatting styles and see how our data is going to look with them. And this is a super easy way to see which one of these formatting types is going to best communicate the trends in our data to our audience or to ourselves when we want to come back and look at this data at a later time. And I think I'm going to stick with icon set for now. Now, all of these pre-built conditional formatting rules are going to be super useful, and oftentimes we're not going to need anything more than that. But let's say we're looking for something very specific within this data, and we don't have an option within conditional formatting that's going to find it for us. So we're going to create our own rule. And let's say we're looking within column E here, within the last name column, and we want to find names that have less than 6 characters. So we're looking at the length of those names, and if they are below 6 characters, we want those to be highlighted in our data. Here's how we're going to do that. We're going to come up to the conditional formatting dropdown and go to new rule. And from this dialog box, we can choose from a bunch of different rule types. We can format all cells based on their values. We can format only cells that contain something, format only top or bottom ranked values, only values that are above or below average, unique or duplicate values, or we can use a formula to determine which cells to format. And right now we're going to use a formula. And once we've selected this option, it says below we can edit the rule description and format values where this formula is true. So this is where we're going to type in our formula. But before we do this, I want to take the formula that we're using, I want to apply it to a cell outside of this formula box and make sure that it works. So let's click cancel here real quick, and let's come up to column I, and let's enter that formula up here and test it out on our own. So we're going to use equal, then we're going to search for the Lang formula. Once we have it, we can hit tab to autocomplete that. And we're looking at the text in the last name column. We're going to start with E2. So let's close that out with the parentheses, and then let's make sure that we're searching for values that are less than 6. So we're going to use the less than symbol, then we're going to enter 6, and let's hit return. And Excel returns a value of false because the last name of Watkins in cell E2 is not less than 6 characters. So what we can do is we can take this formula from cell I2 and we can drag it down to populate the rest of the column with this formula. And this is going to be a preview for how Excel is going to apply this formula within conditional formatting. Every value that this holds true for is going to be highlighted by Excel. And now that we know this formula works, let's come up to cell I2 and hit Control-C to copy that formula. And now let's go into that last name column and let's highlight the entire column so that we can apply our new rule to that column. In the drop-down menu for conditional formatting, let's hit New Rule, and then we can come back down here to use a formula to determine which cells to format. Now within this formula bar, we can just Control-V to apply that formula and hit OK. And something unexpected happens here. We applied that new formatting to these cells, but we're still not seeing any formatting present. So let's come back up to conditional formatting. Let's go to Manage Rules. Let's click on that rule we just entered, and as you can see, no format has been set. So it's been applied to those cells, but we don't actually have a formatting for those cells yet. We want to come back into Edit Rule, and then we want to select a format down here. We can click on the Format option, and let's say we want those to be highlighted in a green. So let's click on that green fill color, hit OK, and then hit OK once more. We can now apply this to our cells and close out. And as you can see, all of these names that are shorter than 6 characters have now been highlighted in green. So in this example, we used conditional formatting to apply a custom rule to the last name column. And you might be wondering why you would need custom rules. Well, let's say that management was sending out emails to these customers to remind them of the balance that they had unpaid. And for whatever reason, the last names that were shorter than 6 characters, the email got all misformatted and it didn't send. So management needs just a list of those customers with the shorter last name so that they can resend that email to them. And in this case, the only way for us to highlight those cells efficiently with conditional formatting was to use that custom rule. And there's really a ton that we can do with different formulas to create custom rules within conditional formatting in Excel. In front of us, we have a data set, and we want to summarize this data set to gain some insights from that data. We're going to use pivot tables to do so. And pivot tables are going to be an incredibly powerful way to gain insights from data. If we wanted to, we could take this data, we could run some formulas over here, potentially filter that data to slowly gain insights from it, but this would take a lot of time. Pivot tables are going to simplify that work for us. So in this table, we have a list of our employees, the products that they're selling, how many they sold, sales price, revenue, and this is all categorized by state and by month. So let's say that some of the insights we want to gain from this data are we want to know the total revenue by month, and we also want to know the revenue by product for each employee. And if we wanted to do this without pivot tables, it would require a lot of filtering, some formulas, but we don't want to go through all of that hassle. So let's quickly turn this data into a pivot table and find these answers in just a few minutes. And there are a few requirements before we create a pivot table. This data has to be in tabular format. It needs to have headers up top. There can't be any blank columns or any blank rows. And so far this looks good, so we can go ahead and create that pivot table. So if we come up here to the Insert tab, there's a pivot table button, and we can go ahead and hit that. Excel's going to find the table range for us. It does a really good job of finding that, and we can create it on a new worksheet or in an existing worksheet. But if you look at this table range, it's a definite table range. So Excel has found from A1 to H23. And if we decide to come back to this table later and add data, it's not going to be included in that pivot table. So before we create this pivot table, let's go ahead and turn this data into a table. And Excel has selected the same range here. It knows that we have headers, so we can go ahead and hit OK. And this way, when we add rows in the future down here, that data is going to be automatically added to our pivot table. And if we want to, we can go ahead and name this table before we create a table. So let's call it sales data and hit enter. So now that we have an Excel table, within the table design tab, there is a summarize with pivot table option. There's also the option to create a pivot table under the Insert tab. We have Pivot Table and we have Recommended Pivot Tables. Let's go ahead and check out the Recommended Pivot Tables because oftentimes Excel is going to have some really good ideas for pivot tables here, and it gives us a bit of a head start. So let's click on that button, and as you can see, we have sum of revenue by state, we have sum of products sold by state, sum of revenue by product, and if we come down a little bit further, we have the sum of products sold by employee and state. So this pivot table right here, while it's not exactly what we wanted, it's kind of close. So maybe we can just manipulate this one to get a head start on creating that pivot table instead of building it out from scratch. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And let's take a look at some of these structural elements for this new sheet. So now that we have a pivot table created, we have this new tab up here in the top ribbon called Pivot Table Analyze with a ton of options. We also have a Pivot Table Design tab. And on the right here, we have this new side pane with pivot table fields. If we want, we can come in here and change the layout of these fields. Usually I like the standard layout though. This is pretty easy to work with. And each of these fields was previously a column header in our table, which is why it's required that our table has column headers before creating a pivot table. At the bottom here, we have our different areas. We have filters, columns, rows, and values. So by dragging these different fields into these areas, we can manipulate our current pivot table and completely create new pivot tables from scratch. So currently we have the sum of products sold by state for each employee. But let's say we want to change this to sum of products sold by month for each employee. We can take the state field that's in the columns area and we can just drag it back up to the fields list to get rid of it. Now instead we're going to select the month and we're going to drag that down into the columns. Now instead we have the sum of products sold by month for each employee. And just like that, our pivot table is giving us a completely different insight based off of the same data. Let's say we want the count of products sold by month for each employee instead of the sum of products sold. We can just click on this little arrow in the sum of products field and go to value field settings. Now we currently have sum, count, average, max, min, a ton of different calculations that we can use to summarize the data. And let's hit count and then select OK. And as you can see, this now displays the count of products sold for each month by employee. And this is very interesting, but it's not the insights that we were looking for. We're looking for the sum of revenue by product for each employee. So we do have the rows set up correctly, but we're going to want to change around these columns and these values. Let's start by changing the columns. Instead of month, we're going to bring that back up to the fields list. We're going to change this to product. Let's click on it, bring it to the columns. And right now this is giving us a count of products sold for each employee. That's not quite what we want. So let's grab the count of products sold field, bring it back up here, and then we're going to select revenue and drag it over into the values field. And the field that we add to this values area is going to decide the data that populates our pivot table. So now it's showing us the sum of revenue by product for each of our employees. And this is a super helpful insight. Let's look at a couple ways that we can manipulate this pivot table to give us even more detailed insights into our data. So let's grab the state field here and let's pull it down to beneath employee in the rows. And now we can see that this sum of revenue is further categorized by each state that the employee made some sales in. And at this point, we might want to make some design changes to our pivot table. One of the easy changes we can make is pivot table styles. Let's say we want this a little more subtle. Let's put it in the gray color. We can also easily change the layout of this pivot table. Currently, it's in report layout, but a lot of people like their pivot tables in tabular form. With tabular form, suddenly we have separate columns for each of these states instead of being listed underneath the employee name. Or let's say perhaps that we want to change it to outline form, which might be good for a final report. But while we're still working with this data, I like to keep it in that tabular form. And by default, this pivot table is going to be showing us the grand totals in its own column. And also at the bottom of the pivot table, we're going to have another row for grand totals. If we'd like to get rid of these, we can come up to grand totals here and we can say off for rows and columns. That's going to remove all of these grand totals. Or we can add them back in just for rows only. On the side here, we have the grand total of each and every row. Or we can add the grand totals back in just for the rows by clicking on only rows. Personally, I like having grand totals on for both rows and columns. And this pivot table has also given us subtotals. We can remove those if we like by clicking do not show subtotals, or we can turn them just on for the bottom group. And out of the box, this pivot table is going to have column headers bolded. We can turn that off if we like. I like to keep it on. We can also turn off the bolded row headers, and we can add banded rows if we like to, but sometimes this makes the data a little bit more confusing, so I'm going to keep them off for now. And that covers most of the common design changes that we can make in pivot tables. Before we hop into the Pivot Table Analyze tab and look at all of the things that we can do from there, let's take a look at just a couple more ways that we can toggle these pivot table fields to display our data differently in the pivot table. So currently we have rows made up of employee and state. Let's say that we only want to show the data for the state of California. We have a filter option here at the top of the state column where we can easily remove select all and just select California to show us just that California data. But there's more than one way to do this, so let's hit Control Z to remove that filter, and then come over here to the rows, and let's drag this state field up into the filters area. So now we've removed states from the pivot table, and instead we have it as a filter up above the pivot table. We can click on the drop down for the filter, and let's select just California. And instantly that data changes to just show the sum of revenue numbers for the state of California. Filters can be incredibly useful in pivot tables, but personally I like to use slicers as much as possible. So let's Control Z twice here to remove that filter. And now state is back down in the rows area again. Let's pull it back up to the pivot table fields. And once we have it up here, let's right click on state and go to add as a slicer. So now we have a slicer over here, which we covered in an earlier lesson, where we can toggle between the different states that we want to display. So we can click on just California from here. If we want to select multiple, we can hit Control and then click on another state. Or we can also click on the multi-select button up here at the top, and then we can select as many states as we want from the list. And a slicer is an incredibly user-friendly way of approaching these different filters because we can easily toggle between them and see those changes instantly. And there's a lot that we can do to manipulate this slicer. If we right-click on the slicer, a bunch of options pop up. Currently it's sorted from A to Z. If we want, we can sort from Z to A. Let's right click again. We can multi-select state. We can remove state if we want to get rid of it. We can change the size and properties and go into slicer settings if we want to drill down and get a little bit more detailed about those settings. But let's go ahead and remove this slicer for now. Now let's take a look at the Pivot Table Analyze tab. There are a ton of powerful options here. On the far left, we have field settings. Previously, we accessed this just by clicking on the drop down by that field. And when the options tab popped up, we went to field settings from here. But if we want to, we can go directly to field settings, and the active field is sum of revenue. So if we'd like, we can change to account of revenue, an average of revenue, or a multitude of options to better summarize that field. And let's stick to sum of revenue for now. We just looked at adding a slicer to a pivot table, and previously we did that by right-clicking on that field and adding as a slicer, but we can also add it in from the Pivot Table Analyze tab. So let's click back into this pivot table so that we have that tab open, and we can insert a slicer from here and select any of these different fields to use as a slicer. And there's a couple of group options right here that we can explore. So let's add back in the state to rows to show this example. And let's click over here on the states and let's group this selection. So before we click on group selection, what we're going to do is we're going to control click on Florida and New York to select both of those. And what we want to do is we want to group our data by the East Coast and the West Coast. So Florida and New York are going to become the East Coast group. Let's hit group selection, and now we have a group 1 up here with Florida and New York. And the name of this group, Group 1, isn't very descriptive of its characteristics. So while we have it selected, let's come up to the formula bar and change this to East Coast. Now let's hit enter, and that looks a lot better, but let's go ahead and widen this column so that we can see the full name of the group. And groups aren't the only thing that we can rename. Let's say we want to rename this table from sum of revenue to just revenue. Let's delete sum of revenue and then hit enter. Excel doesn't want to let us name two things revenue. We already have a field over here that's named revenue, so we can hit OK. And if we want to, we can just put a space here at the end of revenue and then hit enter so that the name is slightly different. And in this pivot table, we can toggle between different groups to show just the entire East Coast group. We could also display just Barbara Watkins instead of all this separate data beneath her. And then we just have Barbara Watkins revenue for each of the products that she's sold. And we can easily expand this back out if we want to show those different states again, and if we want to show the different states within the East Coast group. We also have the option to refresh and change the source data here. We only need to refresh if we make changes in our table, and since this is an Excel table, it's going to automatically update for us, so we're not going to need this. If we want to, we can change the data source. So we could take this pivot table and all of the settings, and we could select an entirely new range of data or an entirely new table to apply this pivot table to. And let's say that we want to apply a field to this table that we currently don't have within the fields, and it's going to be a calculated table, so it's going to be a relationship between two other fields in this table. We can come up here to field items and sets, and we can insert a calculated field. So what we want to do for this field is we want to call it profit, and what we want to take is we want to take the revenue. So let's click on the revenue and hit insert field, and then we want to subtract commission from that. So let's hit insert field once more, and then we can hit OK. Excel has added this field to our values area for us and expanded the pivot table quite a bit. So we now have a total sum of profit after the total revenue column over here. And this is going to give us some very powerful insights. And there's just a few more options in the Pivot Table Analyze tab on the far right over here. We have a field list, so let's say we accidentally click out of Pivot Table Fields. We can select Field List to pull it back up. We can add or subtract buttons. So currently, if we scroll back over here to the left, we can see that we have different buttons on this pivot table. And let's go ahead and get rid of those. Okay, so now we can't really toggle between the different states and the employees. I kind of like having those, so let's add them back. And then if we want to, for some reason, remove the field headers, we can also do that here to get rid of those, and maybe it just cleans up our table a little bit before a final presentation. But let's add those back in for now. And now that we've covered everything that we can do in the Pivot Table Analyze and the Design tabs, let's get back to those initial pivot tables that we wanted to create. So if you can remember, we were looking for a sum of revenue by product for each employee and also a sum of revenue by month. And we previously had this table looking pretty good. It was displaying the sum of revenue by product for each employee. So let's go ahead and clean up these fields just a little bit. We're going to remove sum of profit from the values. Let's also remove state from the rows. And it looks as if we had added state twice to the rows. So let's go ahead and remove that one more time. And now we just have a list of the employees in the rows, the products in each column, and the sum of the revenue as the values. That looks perfect. And the second pivot table that we wanted to create was a sum of revenue by month. So we could come back to our table and insert a completely new pivot table on a new sheet from there. But it looks like we have plenty of room here. So as a shortcut, let's just take this entire pivot table. Let's select the entire range. Let's copy it and then let's paste it right over here. And now that we have this pivot table selected, the side pane over here is only going to apply to our new pivot table. And let's change these fields around so that we have the sum of revenue by month. We can remove the employee field because we no longer need that. And then if we come to month, we can grab that, drop it down, and put it in rows. And this pivot table is looking pretty good, but we didn't need to differentiate by product. So we can grab the product field and pull it back up here. And now we have just the sum of revenue by month. And if we'd like to organize this a little bit more, we can right click on some of the data within this pivot table and we can go ahead and sort that. Let's sort it from largest to smallest so that we know when our best months are. And that looks really good, but let's say that we wanted to display the revenue in each month as a percentage of the total. We can right click once again on one of these values and instead we can show value as and say a percentage of grand total. So now we have the percentages, and as we can see, 27% of our profit was in the month of May. Wow, that's a really good month for us. And we're not very profitable in October. We should probably do something about that. Oftentimes in Excel, we're going to want to visually display the data that we have within datasets and tables. Charts are going to be a great way of doing so. So let's take a look at the basics of charts. We're going to look at some of the most popular charts, how to insert them on a data set, and how to format those charts to best communicate and visualize the data that we want to display. So in front of us, we have a bunch of customer data. We have their last names, their old balances, and new balances. And let's say we want to insert a chart. We're going to begin by working with column and bar charts. So let's go ahead and highlight this range of data. And once we've done that, we can come over to the Insert tab in the top ribbon. And if we select that, there's a charts group within this tab. And so we have in front of us a bunch of different icons that represent the different types of charts that we can insert. And if we'd like to, we can also have Excel recommend charts for us. Let's click on this first just to see what Excel recommends. And as we scroll down this selection, we can see that we have a clustered column, a stacked column, and every time we select one of these recommended charts, Excel is actually formatting our data for us within that chart so we can see exactly what it's going to look like after we select that chart. Pretty useful. But for now, we're going to click cancel, and then we're going to go up to this insert column or bar chart icon. We're going to click on the drop down and just do a simple 2D column. So once we've inserted this chart, we can then move that chart anywhere on the spreadsheet. We can play around with it to get it in the best position so that we can see our entire data set and the chart all within the same worksheet. And up in our top ribbon, Excel has added a chart design tab and a format tab. Let's play around with these a little bit. And we're going to spend most of our time in the chart design tab, but let's take a look at the format tab. And within this, we have different word art styles to choose from. We can give our chart a border that's orange or blue. We can change the fill of the shapes, the outline colors, and we can really do a lot here to manipulate the way that this chart is formatted so that it more clearly visualizes our data. But personally, I am looking for the most simple way to communicate data to an audience, and the pre-built charts that Excel has out for us already do a really good job of that without adding too much fancy designs that might actually take away from that visualization of the data. So let's get back in here to chart design, and Excel's given us some different styles if we want to switch between these. Let's say we like the style 5 a little bit better, so we can go ahead and select that. And now let's come over to the far left side of our chart design tab. We have here an add chart element dropdown and a quick layout dropdown. Let's first explore quick layout. And as we hover over these different layouts, we can see that our data is going to be displayed slightly differently. And maybe we like one of these layouts, we decide that it effectively communicates our data just a little bit better. For example, in layout 5, we also have a data table at the bottom of our chart so that we can now see the exact values of our balance and our new balances. That's pretty cool. Let's add that for now. And let's say that we really like this new chart layout, but we feel like the data table here at the bottom of the chart is just presenting too much information. All of a sudden, it's a little bit too clustered. So we can remove that data table by coming up to Add Chart Element and finding the data table option. Currently, we have a data table with key legends, but we can easily switch back to none. Perfect. Now that chart is very simple and easy to read. And let's see what else we can do with the Add Chart Element dropdown. We can change the axes from primary horizontal to primary vertical. We can add a primary horizontal axis title or just a primary vertical axis title. We can remove the chart title if we like. We can also use data labels to show the exact value of each and every column in our chart. The error bars will show us a standard error on that data, and we can change the grid lines. Let's say we want to be a little bit more detailed here and add minor horizontal grid lines. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. And then if we come back up to Add Chart Element, we can see that previously we had a legend when we changed to chart style 5, but we got rid of that, and let's add it back in as a legend on the right here. So now we know which balance is the old balance and which is the new balance. And if we don't like coming all the way up to the top ribbon here to the Add Chart Element, we can just hit the plus button and we can manipulate those chart elements right next to our table and see what the different outcomes are going to be. And this chart is looking really nice, but we definitely need to button it up. The chart title is not displaying anything useful, so we can just click in here and delete that label, change it over to customer balance. And we also want to change this axis title so that it's a little bit more useful. This axis is currently displaying the customer balances. So let's label this balance and then use a dollar mark so that we're aware that this balance is in currency format. And that's one of the things that we did not do before we created the chart. We did not change these balance columns into currency format. They're still in general, so we can come up here to the top bar and we can change that to currency. We can also do this from within the chart. If we just click into this axis, we go Format Axis, and then we scroll down to the bottom to the number dropdown. And as you can see, when we open this up, it has changed over to currency, and we can go back between general or back to currency and leave it there to make this data a little bit more useful. And when we're happy with those changes, we can go ahead and close out of this side panel. And let's get back into the chart design tab because there's a few more things that we want to take a look at. And from this tab, we can easily change the colors of that chart. These ones are pretty good, but let's say we want something that stands out a little bit less. And this one uses a blue and gray color palette, which I like a little bit better. If we want to switch the column and row, we can just click this button, but that's not really useful for this data, so let's go ahead and switch that back. One thing that I would like to do is I'd like to take this chart and instead of showing both the old balance and the new balance, I want to show only the new balance. So we can do that by selecting data here and unchecking the old balance and hitting OK. Now we're only displaying the new balance. There's also another way to do this. We can hit the filter button on the side of the chart. And from here, we can see that currently only the new balance series is selected. If we want to add the old balance back in, we can just click on that and then hit enter. And as you can see, the chart is back to displaying both the old and new balances. And now that we've made these chart design changes, the chart does a great job of visualizing our data. But let's say that we want to go from a column chart to a bar chart. Let's come back up to the chart design tab in our top ribbon and let's click on change chart type. And this pulls up a dialog box that shows us all of the different chart types at our disposal. Currently, we're using a clustered column, but if we want to switch to a bar chart, we can click on the bar chart option and we have a clustered bar here. Let's zoom in on that to see how it looks, and that looks really good, so we can hit OK. And as you can see, all of our data is now displayed in a bar chart instead of a column chart. The design changes that we previously made on our column chart are still showing in our bar chart, and I think it looks really good. This chart does a great job of visualizing the data that we had in our data set. And that's always the end goal with charts, to effectively communicate our data. When we want to display data as a percentage of the whole, pie charts are incredibly useful. So let's take this data set for example. Let's say that we want to display the sales in each state as a percentage of the total nationwide sales. We can easily do that with a pie chart. So now that we have this range selected, we can come up to the top ribbon and under the Insert tab, we're going to look for the pie chart icon, and from here we can select the type of pie chart that we want from the drop-down menu. There's 2D pies, 3D pies, and donut pie charts. Let's go with a simple 2D pie chart. Now this does a really good job of displaying the sales in each state as a percentage of the whole. But without hovering over this value, we can't really tell what that percentage is. So we want to add data labels, and I could do that myself by clicking on the plus button and coming to data labels and selecting which ones I'd like to add. But instead, I think I'm going to come up to the chart design and see if I can find a chart design that does it for me and does a really good job of just displaying this data in a meaningful way. Now I really like style 8, so let's click on that to select it. And as you can see in this chart, the data labels show the percentage of total sales that each state makes up. Now I think this does a really good job of displaying our data, but let's play around with the formatting a little bit before we decide to save it. So let's come up here to the legend, and if we want to change the formatting of that legend, we can select that legend and then come up to the top ribbon and select the formatting tab to change that around a little bit. We can add an outline in blue, we can change the shape fill, the shape outline, the shape effects, and there's actually more than one way to change this formatting. So instead of coming up to the top ribbon, we could also right click on this legend and click on the Format Legend from the drop-down menu. This is going to pull up a side pane here with some formatting options. And at the moment we can't see all of these options, so let's collapse the chart elements here. There we go. Now we can see the legend options, and let's say we want to move that legend to the right side of the pie chart, or we could even put it on the bottom of the pie chart. I think that the right side looks really good, so let's keep it there. And maybe we want to change the fill of this legend, so we can click on the fill and the border, and let's go to a gradient fill. Now that legend is really standing out, so when people look at our pie chart, they're going to notice the legend, and they're going to see that this pie chart is color-coded per state. And now I'm really happy with this pie chart. So let's close out of this formatting panel and let's just move this pie chart up to the top a little bit. Now let's say for example that we wanted to move this pie chart to an entirely different sheet. We could come up to the chart design tab and click on move chart. From here we could move it to a new sheet, and we can choose the name that we want for that sheet. So let's name it pie chart and hit OK. Now we have a new sheet named pie chart, and now we can see this pie chart in all of its glory because there's no longer a data set to distract us from it. In front of us we have a data set that shows our sales by year. Let's take a look at a few different types of charts that we can use to show the trend in this data. So let's first select this range from A1 to B7, and then up at the top ribbon let's come to the Insert tab, and under Charts let's look for that line chart icon. Here we go, so we can select this drop down and choose from different types of line charts that we want to implement. But just for fun, let's see what Excel recommends. Let's click on Recommended Charts, and this pulls up a dialog box with all of the different charts that Excel thinks might be a good fit for our data. There's a line chart, there's a clustered column, a scatter chart, and a stacked area chart. Let's go back up to the line chart and add that in. So here we have a pretty simple chart of our sales, and it does a great job of showing the trend of the sales that we've made over the years. Let's see if there's any chart styles that we can switch to that might do an even better job of visualizing this data. So these different charts are looking a little bit flashy. Some of them have more detailed backgrounds. This one has some lines drawn onto it so that we can see exactly where those points are on the chart. And here we have labeled points that show the different values, but we no longer have a vertical axis. So let's go ahead and click on this chart. And let's say we want to change some of the formatting here because maybe it's just a little bit too flashy. So let's right click on the background here and go down to Format Chart Area. And this is going to pull up a Format side panel where we can make some changes on the fill and the border of our current chart. So let's switch to no fill, and that's already looking a lot more professional. Now let's close out of that side panel and let's come into the add chart elements because I think we really do want another axis. Let's add a primary vertical, and that makes it just a little bit easier to read. Now let's say we wanted a different way to format that chart background. Instead of right clicking on the background, we can just click on that chart, come up to format, make sure we have the background selected, and then we can change the background from there. Let's go to shape fill and see what it might look like with some different backgrounds. So this one's really subtle. It's not quite as flashy as the past background that we had, and it does a really good job of highlighting our data. Now this is looking really great as a line chart, but let's see what it would look like as an area chart. Let's get back into the chart design tab and go up to change chart type. Now we can come down to area and click on that, and let's hit OK to insert an area chart. Now the area below our line is filled in, and it does a really good job of expressing the magnitude of sales each and every year. But there is one change that I really want to make, so let's come into the add chart elements and take a look at these data labels. I think we should remove them, because we can already see where those different points are on the chart by reading the vertical axis. And now the chart's a little bit less cluttered and more professional looking. And there's just a couple minor formatting changes that I want to make before I think this chart is going to be good to go. So we have one option to come up here to the formatting tab. Usually I like to just right click on a chart element that I want to reformat and make the changes there. So let's click in to this vertical axis, and then we can click on format axis. And once we close out of chart elements, we'll be able to see that whole side panel. And this is looking really good, but I want to make those tick marks just a little bit thicker. So let's come in here to the fill in line and let's change that width. Make them just a little bit bigger. Okay, now those are really easy to see. I think this chart looks great. Let's make it just a little bit smaller and then pull it up here to the top of the sheet. When we have both positive and negative numbers within a data set and we want to show how those numbers contribute to the total, we can use a waterfall chart. So let's take this data set that shows our monthly cash flow, and let's select the entire range here from A1 to B7. Now we can come up to the Insert tab in the top ribbon, and at the right here we see an icon where we can insert a waterfall chart. And let's go ahead and do that. This waterfall chart is going to display our negative numbers in orange and our positive numbers in blue. So as you can see, the first number in May is a negative number, and that decreases us to negative 230. But then with the June number, a positive cash flow of 235 brings us back up to slightly above zero. But then in July, we get another negative cash flow, bringing us back down to below zero. But then between August and October, we have all positive data bars, which bring us to a total cash flow of between 400 and 500. And this chart's going to be super useful when we look back over this cash flow data and we see that May had a massive negative contribution to cash flow. One last thing that we need to do is we need to edit this chart title here. So let's click into it and let's just call it cash flow. Okay, that looks really good, and I think this chart's going to do a perfect job of representing our data when we later present it to management.